Okay, I'm going to go over some of the guidelines. So our guest today is Peter Rossman, the former director of Food Workers International, and he's going to talk about his video lecture, which was in chapter 2, which was called Multinational Corporations and COVID-19, Intellectual Property Rights versus Human Rights. Okay, so we will have two main questions that come from some of the comments to the video lecture on the iVersity platform. After each question, I'll ask Peter Rossman to make a few comments. When he's concluded, we'll open the floor for discussion for hopefully questions. We'll do that for about 20 minutes. We'll move to the second question. We'll do that again. And at the end, we will hopefully have a few minutes left for open discussion. And I would like to ask each one of you, if you do have a question, either put it in chat or use the raise hand function. But to remember to keep mute when other people are talking, as well as when you do, if you do have a question, to just quickly introduce yourself and maybe let us know where you live. Okay, without further ado, I'll ask the first question, and I'll leave it to Peter Rossman to introduce himself further. But I'm going to begin with the first question that came out of the not only the video lecture, but his background paper. And that is, and it's a long question, so bear with me, and it might require maybe perhaps if we could extend it and kind of maybe talk about it in different parts. But the background paper mentions pharmaceutical companies like Pfizer and how they partnered with BioVax to produce the vaccine in South Africa, but only as a fill finish operation. And this is a whole idea based on intellectual property rights in a form of rent extraction that ironically was developed by Coca-Cola, where Coca-Cola would maintain control of the concentration, but then license different bottling plants to do the fill finish operation. And the industry has gone through major transformations. It's become more financialized. It's also used the privatization of sometimes what's ideas developed in the public domain. So I would ask Peter Rossman to comment on that, especially because a company like Pfizer, 80% of their profits come from their patents. And their most profitable drugs are for things like cholesterol and for other things that treat ailments rather than cure illnesses. And in this case, they don't really concentrate on diseases and prevention or curatives, but rather on things that make them more profit. So I'll leave it at that. It's a long, detailed question, but I would ask Mr. Rossman to just kind of give us a background on these transformations in the industry that got us into the trouble we have now with the COVID crisis.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Gifford. First, I should offer a small correction. I was not the director of the IUF. I was the campaigns director for the IUF, which is the International Federation of Unions in Food, Agriculture, Hotels, Restaurants, and Catering. I was there for close to 3 decades. I only retired at the end of last year. So hello, everyone. I'm very pleased to be here. I think that actually there are a number of questions bundled up in this question. So let me try to unpack it a little bit. Of course, I think it's fundamental to always recall that pharmaceutical companies, like all private corporations, are profit-seeking, profit-maximizing organizations. That is their function, and that function may at times conflict radically with social needs, and that's the argument I try to lay out in the paper. What we're seeing with the COVID crisis and the inability to manufacture and distribute enough vaccines to actually stop the pandemic is a classic case of private versus public interest. Coca-Cola is certainly not unique in developing a reliance on intellectual property, but I made that analogy because the Coca-Cola company discovered early on that it was more profitable to rely on income from registered trademarks and patents than to actually produce the world's Coca-Cola supply. So what they do is license the manufacturer to various bottlers, although they still make some themselves. And that guarantees a steady flow of income in the form of royalties, which also have the benefits of being taxed at a much lower rate than if they were sales on manufactured products. So they have a guaranteed income stream, but at the same time, they have to strictly control the use of the trademark. So there's always a tension between licensing the brand name and maintaining the integrity of the profits and securing the company's sales. You see it in many forms. Apple, for example, is essentially a bundle of intellectual property. Its power, its revenue, its influence depend on patents, on trademarks, on protected industrial designs. But Apple itself makes almost nothing. They don't make smartphones. It's a branded product. So they don't have to sink money into plant equipment. They don't have to deal with workers. They don't have to deal with unions. They can outsource any inquiries about their social responsibility to place it in the hands of those who provide the various products that ultimately are assembled into a smartphone. Hotels, for example, the international hotel business is dominated by a handful of international hotel chains, but they're essentially branding operations. So Hilton owns no hotels, or virtually none. Intercontinental, Marriott, all the big familiar hotel names are essentially branding operations. So they're released from the obligation to invest in real estate, in hotels, in workers, and they simply can sit back and profit from these guaranteed revenue flows. In the case of the pharmaceutical industry, they were, as I described in the paper, through the 1970s, integrated operations. They did their own research in-house, they did product development in-house, they did their testing in-house, and they produced in-house. And they discovered that it was actually more profitable to outsource all of these operations. So while they do conduct some research and development, and of course they do make medical and pharmaceutical products, the bulk of their operations consist of generating revenue through licensing. And the problem is that when you have a global emergency, which requires a radical increase in the production of vaccines, they can't make that need themselves. They have no surplus capacity, so they have to turn to outsourcing. And the risk with outsourcing is that their intellectual property, which is the source of their profits, risks being diffused. So there's a tension between the need to expand production and the absolute urgency, as corporate managers perceive it, of protecting the value of their intellectual portfolio. And that's why the world needs vaccines, and we don't have them.
Great, excellent, great background. So we'd like to open the floor to anyone who does have a question. So anyone does have a question. I do see that, Mon, do you want to go ahead? Why don't you speak to yours question?
Okay, sorry. I have to chat because I have to leave in 30 minutes for another webinar. But thank you very much, Peter, for that clarification about what has been happening right now in the global situation. Actually, my question in the chat box was related to the trade unions suppose the turning point that they see that the impact of COVID-19 has been widespread, and it really produced a negative consequences. Of course, we can see that economic, social consequences are hitting everyday's people's lives. So it seems that this is the right moment for the trade union to really cemented their forces and looking at it as a turning point to consolidate and look at how capitalist failure, and by posing that these big pharma multinational are raking profit at the expense of public health. And of course, you can see that millions of people lives are lost. So for me, what do you think that it should be? Should the trade union movement should take it as their best opportunity to really uh, change the economic paradigm with this kind of situation the big pharmas has been doing? Thank you.
Yeah, Peter, could you take that question?
Yes, I absolutely agree. I think it's not only an opportunity, it's an absolute necessity. Unions have to fight to reclaim public space, including that space which is home to the production of public goods. Medicines are public goods. The right to health is a universal human right. And if individual corporations cannot be relied upon to provide treatments, vaccines, diagnostics, and everything else you need to fight a pandemic, then governments have to step in and start reassuming the role which they've abandoned over the past decades. One of the things that I did not get into in the paper is that the crisis that we're currently experiencing with the pandemic is not simply about a shortage of vaccines. It's about the consequences of decades and decades and decades of imposed austerity on governments, which have stepped back from the role of supporting the provision of health services. Health services have been decimated, not only in developing countries, but in wealthier countries as well. So what you see with COVID is that universities, which are in principle public institutions, are completely in control of a process which is essentially privatized the results of public research. And medical facilities have been decimated, and it's been a condition, for example, of the international financial institutions, the multilateral lending agencies, that is a condition for receiving new loans, which drive countries like the Philippines deeper into debt bondage, that they continue to dismantle what is left of public health services. So it's not only an opportunity. The trade unions, together with all the allies they can find in civil society, and in the case of the pandemic, there are many allied organizations, have to fight urgently to reclaim that public space. It's not just about vaccines, it's about restoring the role of government in supporting public health.
Great. Other questions? Now, maybe to kind of follow along with that, clearly, you know, in the neoliberal era, this is how corporations operate. But in the pharmaceutical or the healthcare industry, were there any pivotal turning points? I mean, could you point to a time when this process intensified? Like you said, it was the 70s when they noticed that, you said they were vertically integrated until about the 70s. What were some of the changes that sparked it? I mean, could it be regulatory, or I'll leave it to you to kind of let us know how this process began?
Well, that's a complex question, but in a nutshell, many corporations in the 1970s began to experience a crunch on profits. And part of the solution was increasingly to escape the constraints of a rather well-organized pharmaceutical industry with a fairly high degree of union density and a fairly dense coverage of collective bargaining agreements, to outsource production to developing countries. Another pivotal development took place, I believe, initially in the United States in 1980, when the US government passed a law which enabled universities and private businesses to patent the results of publicly funded research. And that turned the universities into profit-generating mechanisms in the service of private corporations. And the real scandal, among the many scandals of the COVID pandemic, is that the companies which are now reaping enormous profits from manufacturing vaccines were up to 97% funded by government money. So it's a classic case of socializing costs and privatizing profits.
Yeah, thank you. Any other questions? Okay, Philip, could you go take the floor?
Sure. You said technology is not part of the pharmaceutical company producing medicines. Okay. What about that Bill Gates? He's a technology tycoon, and then his foundation get lots of funding from Warren Buffett, and Buffett is a big shareholder of Coca-Cola. Isn't that not connected? Okay, thanks.
Well, it's not that the companies don't possess technology, it's that the companies keep a very tight grip on the technology. So much of the campaigning around widening access to vaccines has been aimed at a waiver on the TRIPS obligations imposed on member states at the WTO. And that, of course, is crucial. But it's not sufficient. What is really needed is a radical increase in the production of vaccine and the establishment of vaccine manufacturing hubs in regional and sub-regional parts of the world where currently there is none. That means virtually all of Africa, that means important parts of Asia, and that means parts of Latin America. And in order to do this, the corporate control of the vaccine technology and all the knowledge that goes with it has to be transferred to countries which can manufacture the vaccine on the basis of that knowledge and on the basis of that technology without the fear of being hit by lawsuits, private lawsuits brought by corporations, or a complaint at the WTO, which would impose sanctions. Because if a country today were to support unlicensed manufacture of a vaccine, they could be the target of a complaint at the WTO, whose dispute resolution body could then determine that they have violated a company's intellectual property rights and impose sanctions on the country. And of course, the company itself cannot bring a complaint to the WTO. That can be done in various trade and investment agreements that have been signed between countries or groups of countries, but the WTO is a body of states, and a state which is home to a pharmaceutical corporation could bring a complaint alleging that its intellectual property rights have been infringed, and the WTO could impose sanctions. And those sanctions could be crippling, particularly for a poor country which is dependent on a limited number of exports. So the power of the WTO is to impose sanctions, and the power to impose sanctions is the power which prohibits the transfer of technology which could enable the expansion of vaccine production. As far as what I understood the question to be about Bill Gates, the Gates Foundation is heavily involved in some of the international mechanisms like COVAX, which was supposed to facilitate the distribution of vaccines to countries which have no capacity to produce them themselves. And all of this expanded production is allegedly to take place without infringing at all on the company's patents and intellectual property. And as a consequence, it has not succeeded. COVAX has delivered less than 10% of the vaccine doses it promised. And the promise was already deliberately unambitious. And in the paper I mentioned Gates and Microsoft, because it's not simply the pharmaceutical companies that are opposed to loosening intellectual property rights. All corporations see the maintenance of their intellectual property portfolios as essential to their profitability and to the stability of the system of neoliberal capitalism, if you will, and therefore they oppose any breach in it. There can be no waiver of the TRIPS obligations. So the pharmaceutical companies, just as Mr. Gates is opposed to lifting intellectual property protection on pharmaceutical products, the pharmaceutical industry would be opposed to any project, for example, to make open source software freely available to people. So there's a shared interest in defending intellectual property as a whole. I would say the capital is more or less united in that defense.
Aisha, why don't you take the floor?
Yeah, thank you for your talk. I just wanted to say, doesn't that then defeat the purpose of the whole human right to health debate if you have very strong pharmaceuticals and their interests at the forefront when you have these trips? And how can then human rights activists, unions, challenge such a strong force where the state's interests are also not really there? You cannot really have strong states within the WTO if you have the very weak states with low bargaining power. And then the issue of how that all works out, because you said you have this human right to health, and that's a key right, which can only be safeguarded if all nations and all people can have access to free drugs. But if the companies are not willing to let go of their intellectual property, and the system, the World Trade System, is so built to protect their interests, how does one really challenge that?
Well, I absolutely agree that there is a fundamental contradiction between, for example, the human right to health and the unconditional defense of the intellectual property, which is the source of the power of the pharmaceutical companies. There are many ways to look at this. And one of them is to think of the hierarchy of international law. So the WTO treaties have the force of international law, and they're enforceable at the WTO. The human right to health is recognized as a universal human right. No government would dispute that. It's laid out in a number of fundamental human rights treaties, conventions, various other instruments. The problem is that trade trumps rights. And in the most general sense, what we're fighting for is to subordinate investor rights to human rights. And one of the places where that struggle takes place today is in the fight for access to treatments for COVID-19. But the two are incompatible. It's impossible to maintain that governments have an obligation under human rights law to do everything within their power to secure the right to health of their citizens, and at the same time to insist on the sanctity of the treaties of the WTO. The two are in absolute opposition. So at the level of international law, I think what is needed is a fundamental revaluation in which investor rights and commercial treaties are strictly subordinated to the requirements of international human rights obligations. And the situation we live in today is exactly the reverse. If there's a conflict between private interests and public health, the private interests prevail.
Okay, thank you. Suzanne, you have a question? Please take the floor.
Hello, my name is Susanne Düring. I'm from Hamburg, Germany still, but I'm on my way to Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. As soon as I get my visa, I will be gone. But I hope I have the time to continue taking part here. To my mind just came the question, what you just described, is it like this all over the world? I was thinking about like India and China. Do they have different rules, or is it the same there, that the corporations, that the intellectual property rights, are they also there like privatized and above everything? Or are there other countries maybe which, where they have a different policies or regulations?
Well, intellectual property rights are maintained in every member state of the WTO. To be a member of the WTO, governments have to commit to respecting the various treaties, including the TRIPS. And there is no major pharmaceutical producing country, apart from Russia, which is not a member of the WTO. Mexico, for example, has been encouraging and funding in a limited way the development of vaccines, which they've pledged to make available on an open source basis. And Cuba actually has done the same. Cuba is not a member of the WTO. These are not countries with major pharmaceutical industries, although both have developed significant pharmaceutical sort of subsectors of their own. But the struggle, I think, eventually will essentially take place in those countries which are members of the WTO, because that's where the world's leading pharmaceutical companies are headquartered. Sinovac in China is a private corporation.
Jagmeet, could you take the floor?
Yes, thank you very much. It's rather a comment or just some reflections. I think also connected with Susanna's questions as well. I see there's a lot of dead end in this. In these situations. One dead end is that, for example, in India, China, especially India, is the biggest producer of this valid of the TRIPS, the intellectual property in the pharmaceutical companies, which provide a lot of cheap drugs actually supplied to the world. But at the same time, India always been listed in the list of the WTO, which are valid of the intellectual property. And that's one of the way today how actually India or China is engaging with such a situation, which valid the intellectual property rights and then produce these cheap drugs and supply to domestically or internationally. This is one dialogue. The other dialogue, as also you mentioned also in the lecture, was also today we know that there are so many public institutions was funded by the government, which are together connected with the pharmaceutical companies in terms of COVID vaccine as well. We see actually many pharmaceutical companies was actually strongly using a lot of that intellectual property rights from the public institutions. And but the problem is when it comes to the situations at the end, first of course the country going to prioritize their own interest. When it's coming to the international arenas, it's still becoming another dead end somehow, in my point of view. So how can we actually, I don't know, that's why I call this all a dead end, because how can we do with these situations? Because the private companies taking advantage of the public funds, which are all collected from the taxpayers, and at the end, but they're still using this as trying to as you talked, there's many decades of problems within this in the situation in the pharmaceutical company in terms of distribution of these public goods. So although it's everyone would nobody wants to agree that it's the right to health is a fundamental human right. But see, with this kind of persistent problems within the system for decades, I don't know. It's just, for me, it's so much dead end. What's your comment on that?
Well, my comment would be that the situation is as you described, and we have to fight to reclaim that public space. We cannot rely on private corporations to deal with not only with pandemics, but with many of the health issues that affect people, particularly in developing countries. There's simply no money in developing a malaria vaccine. The companies will not do it. These are profit-seeking private institutions, and they will produce those products which can generate the highest returns to the investors in their companies. That's the competition. The competition is between the companies to reward investors. And you don't reward investors by developing treatments for malaria, for example, or tuberculosis, which primarily affects people in poor countries. There's no profit in it. Any company which decided to devote a portion of its budget to investing in the treatment of tropical diseases would instantly be punished on financial markets and would retreat immediately. So it's a question of reclaiming that space. There's no theoretical or empirical reason, I think the COVID crisis shows, for relying on private corporations to deal with issues of public health. They simply cannot do it.
Great. So I'm going to move on to the next question, which again is kind of a little bit complex. But the next question was based on the written responses to the exercises that followed the video lecture. And we had some responses, mostly from Africa and the Philippines, where the conditions aren't very good. Somebody from Uganda, perhaps he's here today, said that less than 1% of the population has been vaccinated. Another from Zimbabwe noted that the only option they had was the Chinese vaccine, and people were hesitant, and it caused a slow uptake of taking the vaccine. And also, some of the provisions for the poorer countries were hijacked by the wealthier countries, which were able essentially to hoard the vaccines. And this has just created a problem. And, sometimes the commenters in the Philippines said that the rich countries were able to hoard the higher efficacy vaccines. There's been attempts, as you said in your paper and in the lecture, that Costa Rica has made a call for international solidarity. Your paper had an amazing example of in Canada during the Ebola crisis, they produced a non-commercial vaccine for Ebola. Have there been any further attempts? Now, we're talking about the problems. Have there been steps towards successfully overcoming some of the contradictions that we've been talking about all day? In this session, have there been any progress? Can you give us any accounts of any of those?
I think the short answer is no. There is rhetorical support for a TRIPS waiver. It's concentrated at the WTO. The WTO is only one part of the problem, because even if the WTO were to agree to a waiver on a TRIPS waiver on all aspects of treating and containing COVID-19 in all its variants, that still would not deliver vaccines. It would remove a layer of legal uncertainty, which makes countries hesitant to support efforts to produce vaccine without obtaining the explicit approval of the patent holders. So it's a question of resolving the deadlock at the WTO, but also of pushing governments to actually take concrete measures to expand vaccine production and to expand the production of everything that is needed to contain the pandemic. By releasing into the public domain some of the patented information, by actively supporting measures to transfer the technology so that countries can begin producing vaccines, and to get serious about financing some of this because it can't be done for free. So the struggle takes place on multiple levels. And one thing I learned from a life spent in the labor movement is that nothing happens unless people organize to make it happen. So countries need governments, particularly those governments who are blocking developments at the WTO, need to be pushed. And I think the importance of this initiative by Costa Rica and other countries at the WTO to create what is called CTAP as an open source space for disseminating knowledge and technology and potentially for securing financing, is that it represents, on paper at least, because it has to be given real content, an open source space dedicated to the satisfaction of emergency needs in a global pandemic in a UN system which has become increasingly corporatized. So it's there. And I think if we want action, the first thing is to say what's there. And once we identify what's there, to organize to get that space to actually happen and to make things move. And the real importance of this, I think, is that it shows where organizing efforts have to be directed, because only governments can solve this problem. The companies will not do it. And I think it's important to remember this. You know, patents are not simply something written down in a little book that's housed in a safe in the basement of some gigantic corporation. They're actually in the possession of governments. If you have a patent, let us say a patent on a vaccine, it's in a government patent office. Governments can publish that information. And that's what they need to begin doing, and much more, of course.
Okay, thank you. Any questions? Well, any questions? Not seeing any. Adora?
Yes, actually, I had my hand raised for the previous discussion, but I think it links very much with this question now, just showing us that when it comes to the vaccine, but perhaps on other issues too, the terrain of the struggle still remains the state. And as Peter was giving more examples showing that, so I was wondering, Peter, whether what does the history of South Africa's movement in terms of HIV/AIDS drugs teaches us in this particular conjuncture in which we are. So what can we learn from those efforts back then on how social movements and civil society organizations were able to actually get the state on board? So
Well, I think what the South African experience very clearly shows is that resistance pays. When people organize, one can make progress. So that the ultimate result of the struggle in South Africa was, first, the companies had to retreat. Second, it became feasible to manufacture generic versions of antiretroviral treatments for HIV/AIDS. But the second lesson is that it wasn't consistently followed through, so that we have to remember that, for example, last year, 600,000 people died of HIV/AIDS, mostly in developing countries. So one of the paradoxes of South Africa's fight for access to affordable medicines was a sharp reduction in the price of HIV/AIDS treatments in wealthier countries, where the number of deaths from HIV/AIDS has dropped dramatically. It's still ravaging large parts of the world. And another very interesting thing, which I mentioned in passing in the paper, So South Africa changed its laws in 1998. They got hit by a lawsuit by multinational pharmaceutical companies, as well as the South African Pharmaceutical Manufacturers Association. So they had a domestic component as well, and the companies were forced to back off. Now, it's my belief that if a single wealthy country or a group of wealthy countries were willing to take the lead in actually using the space that the WHO has now opened up with CTAP, I don't think they would face lawsuits by pharmaceutical companies. I think politically it would be impossible for a major pharmaceutical company to sue the government of the United States or Germany or Switzerland. And if they did, it would cause such a political tempest that obviously we would have to organize to meet that. I think that would simply intensify the debate, just as it did in South Africa. I think politically it's impossible. So what is holding back governments is not the fear of legal repercussions. It's this religious allegiance to intellectual property rights, which brings me to what I wanted to say a minute ago, which is that, so in 2001, the WTO issued its famous Doha Declaration, which on paper said that in a national health emergency, it's perfectly legal and consistent with the TRIPS obligations for a country to authorize under compulsory licensing the manufacture of patented drugs without the approval of the patent holder. But it took 16 years to fully clarify this article in the TRIPS agreement, and that was in 2017. And when that was clarified, 30-something of the richest countries in the world informed the WTO that they would not make use of this possibility. In other words, they would not protect their populations in the event of a public health emergency if it meant infringing on intellectual property rights. So intellectual property rights emerged triumphant from the South African experience, and that's what you see today. There was a significant challenge. There was a partial victory. It was never followed up, and the consequence is what you see today. Does that answer some of the question, at least? So the fight continues, basically, is what I'm saying. It's never over. I think every trade unionist knows there are never any permanent victories. There's only constant struggle.
Other questions? Well, I have a question. Oh, go ahead, Aisha. Take the floor, please.
Sorry. Yeah, just to come back to the point about human rights being trounced by trade, or as we see with the case of the low developing countries or the countries in the global south. And then we have these examples where actors, non-governmental actors in the global south, as we saw in South Africa, took up this cause to challenge the state and the role in protecting the nationals. So if we look at it then, that which rights are considered more important, that the rights from the corporations, as we saw with the case of intellectual property. And then when I think about it, that the rights under the United Nations regime, that we are taught in our countries that we have to uphold these rights. And then when you look at the global north, you have the World Trade Organization regime having the dominance. And how does one, that's really the question that's bothering me, how to really challenge that and not leave it to states within this whole World Trading Organization, and whether that system really needs to be taken down and a new type of organization to be established that specifically handles corporations, multinational corporations, or how can they be involved within the whole human rights framework, which is usually left to states because that's the framework of international law? Thank you.
Well, international human rights law, the problem is that international human rights law applies to governments. Governments have obligations under international human rights treaties. They've signed other international conventions, other international instruments, which obliges them to defend and to advance those rights, which in many cases, as we see, for example, in with the COVID pandemic, but of course we see in many, many other areas, which often conflict with their obligations under the rules of the WTO and all the other treaties that have been built onto the WTO. The WTO is simply the foundational architecture of the world trading system, which maintains corporate dominance. And so only governments, I believe, can implement these human rights obligations. Because international human rights law applies only by implication to corporations. It's written by and for governments. And I believe that what is needed in terms of an international framework is a legal structure which enables governments who are in earnest about implementing their human rights obligations, when forced into a conflict between defending the rights of corporations, which, remember, are not human rights. There is no human right to a dividend. There's no human right to a patent, right? These are legal claims. These are not human rights. And what is needed is an international framework which would enable governments to act with a degree of legal certainty and in the absence of financial and political pressure to restrict the rights of corporations when there is a clear conflict between investor claims and the human rights treaties and the obligations they've signed on to. And that is a long-term project. In the context of COVID, again, I think the very fact that there exists, even if only on paper, somewhere in the United Nations system, somewhere in the World Health Organization, a space which was created to diffuse rather than to restrict knowledge to deal with the pandemic, is one place we could put our energy. So this space exists. What are governments doing about it? Why aren't they making use of it? Unions can be more explicit in asking their governments. Here's a space. It's housed inside the United Nations system. We're not making it up. What are you doing? Why aren't you offering financing? Why aren't you acting to push your companies into participating in this arrangement? So that's a small place we can seek to reclaim a little bit of the public power that we've lost over all these decades. And if that were to succeed, I think it would be possible to build on that. If I could digress for a minute, is that okay? If I could digress for a minute, as I suggested initially, intellectual property is not limited to pharmaceuticals. So I worked in a union of food and agricultural workers, an international federation of unions of food and agricultural workers for close to 3 decades. And over the course of those 3 decades, it became very clear that there was a fundamental struggle to defend the world's food resources and the world's food producers from corporations who were using intellectual property to gain control of those resources. So for example, for thousands and thousands of years, for millennia, farmers and peasants have saved the seeds which they use to grow plants. They've exchanged them, they've improved them through crossbreeding, and the result is what was at one time an abundance of seed resources to feed humanity. And over the past 3 decades, corporations have patented seeds, which carry with them the obligation to purchase anew those seeds every year. If you buy Roundup Ready seeds produced by Monsanto, which is now part of Bayer, which is also a pharmaceutical company, you sign a contract that you won't share those seeds with anybody and that you will not save them. So every year you have to buy those seeds again, just like with a prescription drug. You have to keep going back to the pharmacy. So the struggle for the world's food resources, and the right to food as a human right, is also a struggle against those corporations which are seeking to privatize those resources and impose their seeds on developing countries. And that is a struggle over intellectual property rights.
Very interesting example. Suzanne, you have another question?
Yeah, I was wondering if you have an idea why countries don't try to take that struggle, especially those who are interested in them. I mean, I'm from Germany, and here we are already talking about the third vaccination to people. So, I mean, why should Germany? Of course, I mean, they could do it to be a good country, but I mean, they're happy here. Yeah, it's a egoistic, ignorant position, but here they're happy. Yeah. So, I mean, who would be interested in doing something about the COVID vaccine, for example, would be the countries that haven't had so many jabs yet. And some of them, of course, a lot of them are from the developing or from the global south, but not all of them are weak and don't have power, don't have money, don't have connections. And I wonder why, especially with that example from South Africa, even if it doesn't go through all the way, but I mean, it showed it is possible. And I wonder, I don't know, like countries like Nigeria, which is quite a big, strong country. Do you have any ideas why they hold back in a situation like this? I mean, I don't want to excuse my country. It's very embarrassing that Germany is acting as it is, wrong, but I'm still wondering why those who are in need and would have the power, why don't they move on?
Well, I would say 2 things. It's not simply a question of Germany being a good country. Germany and its citizens have an interest in stopping the spread of the virus. From the outset of this pandemic, governments, including those in wealthy countries, have been singing the song, "No one is safe until everyone is safe."
Yeah, but
so Germans, just like Nigerians, have an interest in stopping the spread of the pandemic because the alternative is impossible. It's to build an electronic fence around Germany. Yeah, and no one will get in.
I understand.
I'm not simply speaking about refugees from Afghanistan or Syria. No one will get in because there's no way to control the virus without physically isolating the population. And presumably Germany left that behind when the Berlin Wall was dismantled. So it is correct to say that no one is safe until everyone is safe. But what we're hearing is that no one is safe unless intellectual property is safe, and that hasn't worked. The questions of the bargaining power of South Africa and Nigeria, they have considerably less bargaining power than, for example, Germany. And at the WTO, for example, consensus is required. Every member state would have to agree to support a TRIPS waiver. And so you still have to deal with the Germanys of this world.
Do you have take the floor, please?
Yes. I just want to share just one of the observations. I'm from China. I live here in Brazil. It's just a very simple observations. I think it's quite interesting. And one voice is very clear, and we have to emphasize the importance of the public health systems in developing countries. I think this is significantly important, especially under the pandemic. What I observed here in Brazil is very interesting because previous years, people are, especially middle class, because they are not using the public healthcare system, they're using private one. So they don't really care about the SUS, which is the public healthcare system in Brazil. So they don't really care about, and they always complain, okay, there's too much budget to the SUS, and the SUS is a little bit too much bureaucratic, and it's not functioning very well, because normally you have to waiting for a long time. But they don't understand how important it is. And this time, actually, now you see a lot of social movements, supporting SUS. I observed from middle class is very obvious, because what we can see compared with Brazil and India, because we see that actually many people, many middle classes in the pandemic, especially after the second waves, many middle class was left India. And somehow they believe there's other way of treating better. But here in Brazil, as long as all the countries blocked, you cannot travel. Now the middle class also understand, okay, they are benefit from the public service as well. So I just want to highlight, in whatever the circumstances for developing countries, or maybe for all, the public healthcare system is the most important. And we should keep that. It should not really privatize, because there's a voices here in Brazil. They want to privatize that as well. Yeah, thank you.
We have time for perhaps another question. Well, I think I'll ask a question, and this is kind of, again, about public policy affecting positive outcomes. When I followed the COVID crisis, it struck me that being an island, Taiwan was pretty effective early on, and it didn't hurt that the former vice president was an epidemiologist, and they really got early on big data, contact tracing, provision of PPE, and making sure that there was enough supplies. And it struck me as that was a result of the memory of the SARS crisis in 2002 to 2004. Being an island, though, it's limited. They can control the income of migration. Would you say that could be a positive example of kind of the government getting ahead and taking the right measures? But again, I think Taiwan did suffer because not being a member of the WHO wasn't able really to get sufficient supplies of vaccinations.
Well, clearly governments that got out in front did a much better job of controlling the spread of COVID than governments which were essentially passive. Obviously, as I suggested in discussing Germany, most countries are not island nations, and many island nations are poor, unlike Taiwan, and have very, very ineffective or non-existent public health systems. So the island option is one that's not generally available. And I think, it's interesting the way if you look at the responses to various global crises. When the international financial system threatened to melt down in 2008, governments were able to agree rather quickly on a series of measures. And while they didn't violate anyone's intellectual property, governments found themselves doing things that they were not accustomed to doing. They took exceptional measures in a coordinated international effort to save global finance. Faced with an epidemic that's already killed, 5+ million people and possibly double that, there seems to be paralysis. And I think again, the only answer to that is organization.
Thank you. I see that we're out of time. So I want to thank all of you for participating. It's been a wonderful discussion. Peter, I want to thank you very much for your contribution. I really learned a lot during this session. And thank everyone for coming. We're out of time, but take care, and we'll finish off here.
And thanks to everyone.
Thank you very much. Stay safe, everyone.